Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in the Harvard Classic Lectures. We are in volume number 5. This is lecture number 36 on Emerson's American Scholar. Now, I want to just remind you, those of you, for example, who did not listen to my lecture on the introduction comments to Emerson, I recommend that you go to learnstrong.net. Down the left-hand side there, find the information regarding Harvard Classics. Scroll down, find for sure lecture number 35, although in this lecture I'm going to make some references to other lectures that I've given as part of the Harvard Classics lectures. And for sure watch my introduction to Emerson. I think that will be of benefit to you. Just to remind, we are looking at Emerson from at least 3 different perspectives. We want to think of Emerson as Emerson the man, Emerson the teacher, and the primary focus there is his life's passions, his life's work, and of course the pain of his life as well, as we pointed out in a prior lecture. We want to talk about Emerson as philosopher, as idealist, as transcendentalist. We're going to see some of that already in our study of the essay called American Scholar. And then finally, we want to pay attention to Emerson as artist, as creator in our learning and reading theory, what we call to be. Just to remind you, speaking of our ideas of reading, we want to ask about any essay that we're looking at today, American Scholar. What does the text say? Level 1. What does the text mean? Level 2. Here we subdivide major themes, major messages, as well as to be the rhetoric that we were just talking about. Because here we're really wanting to emphasize the genius of Emerson's prose. And then finally at level 3, how can I relate to the text? This is our understanding of learning theory, that ability to connect new information to old information. And while that idea is a very old idea, taking us all the way back to Plato, and of course some early lectures on Plato I've given already, we still want to point out that our 303 definition of learning as that ability to connect new information to old information actually is derived from Emerson and an essay like American Scholar. We'll see. For us, this is really the key, to let Emerson challenge you. Now, hey, I've said this before in other lectures. Let me say it now. I'm concerned sometimes when I hear my own colleagues denigrate or speak badly about your generation as being unpatriotic. You don't care about your town, you don't care about your country, you don't care about your world. And I'm not convinced that's the case. But I will say this. If it is the case, and I've said this in other lectures, I'll say it now. If it is the case that you don't have a real deep passion for your country, I don't believe it's your fault. I think it's the fault of those of my generation who have not given you legitimate reasons to be patriotic. Telling you to be patriotic is not going to make you patriotic. You're not born a patriot. You have to choose to be a patriot. The reason you choose to be a patriot is you look at your country and you say, amazing. Now, the only way I think that you get there is to be properly exposed to the ideas that made your country great. I believe that a study of Ben Franklin, I said this earlier, a study of Ben Franklin is a classic way to get there. A study of Tom Jefferson is a way to get there, as we've said in other lectures. And many of the other great American thinkers. I'm going to argue that Emerson will make you stand up and say, whoa, this is the intellectual legacy as an American that I have. And of course, as an individual of the world, Emerson is very cosmopolitan. He's going to make references in the American Scholar essay, as he does in most of his great writings, to ideas outside of America and even outside of Europe. And that, in my estimation, makes him great. Now, again, we're not here to simply agree, genuflect, and worship a great mind, or to just be combative and disagree. Remember our understandings from Bacon's of Studies. Rather, we're reading to appreciate, to try and come to some ideas that we ourselves can actually work with. Now, let's do some quick background information here. This is a speech, American Scholar, given to Harvard's Phi Beta Kappa, the top students at Harvard, 31 August 1837, 1 year after he had published his classic essay, Nature, which does not appear in the Harvard Classics, and yet such an important essay, really almost like a book-length essay. Emerson outlined it and called it and retitled it American Scholar in the 1841 publishing. And here he changed the title a little bit from just simply an oration to the American Scholar, probably to speak more directly to all American students, because Emerson, as we're looking at him as that great teacher, first and foremost always thought of himself as an educator. Before he was a philosopher, I think he always thought of himself as an educator, an individual who wanted to share ideas. And now to a brief outline. Let's just play this game really quickly. It's for your notes. It's an essay of 5 parts. Now, if you can get a copy of this essay, and I hope that you have it in front of you while we're working, I definitely recommend that you number the paragraphs 1 through 45 so that you've got all of them listed there for you. The first 7 are introduction, and here we're going to basically just kind of set up what it is that Emerson is wanting to talk about, how the scholar fits into society, quote, what he calls man thinking. And then the rest of the essay, the 4 sections to follow, paragraphs 8 and 9, he'll talk about the influence of nature. Paragraphs 10 through 20, the influence of the past and especially books. Paragraphs 21 through 30, the 4th part on the education, right, of the thinking man. What kind of education does the American scholar need? And then finally, paragraphs 31 through 45, the duties of the scholar, the views on modern America, and the importance of why America needs its scholars, needs its thinkers, needs its students. Now, one of the reasons why I love to teach this essay is because it challenges not just students, but teachers to begin to think again about how Emerson believed that America was built through its schools. And if that was the case when this essay was delivered, I certainly think it's still the case today. And so I'm going to try to make some arguments that are very practical, right? In other words, the question that they always said you shouldn't ask, when are we ever going to use this? That is a legitimate question, and I think you shouldn't run away from it. I think you should embrace it. Of course, let's say it out loud, 1 or 2 of us who are juniors and seniors, when we are taking the ACT or the SAT, we probably lament the fact, for some of us, that we didn't pay close enough attention in 6th, 7th, and 8th grade mathematics because no teacher gave us a legitimate answer to the question, when am I ever going to need this? And so we didn't learn it, and now, of course, we probably do lament that we didn't learn it. To read this essay well, American Scholar, you need to have some background knowledge. At least it will help. For example, you really need to know your Plato because Emerson believes that you know your Plato. I recommend, for example, that you go back to my Harvard lectures, Harvard Classics lectures 5, 6, and 7, and take a look at those lectures I gave on Plato's Apology, Plato's Crito, Plato's Phaedo. You might want to go as well to learn strong. Find that AP folder at the top there and scroll down and find my lectures on Plato's Republic and watch those lectures, especially, of course, on Plato's views on education. Emerson kind of assumes that you know that. Of course, he also assumes that you know your Stoic philosophers, especially Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius. Those are my Harvard Classics lectures for number 8 and number 9. I recommend that you at least have some working familiarity with that information. Emerson's going to assume you know your Bacon. He even mentions Francis Bacon in this lecture, and more particularly of studies, I give some information there on the Harvard Classics lecture number 10. And of course, let's just say it, when Eliot was putting together the Harvard Classics, he knew what he was doing by having the Emerson volume number 5 follow the Milton poetry volume of volume number 4. Certainly, Milton's ideas on education in that famous Tractatus on Education, and I talk about that in the Harvard Classics lecture number 11. So having said all of that, it's an advantage to have that background knowledge, what we sometimes call prior knowledge, so that we can now turn to this lecture. And I'll say now what I've said in many of the other lectures. I would love to be able to just read word for word all of this essay to you. I love Emerson's prose. I love to read Emerson's prose. But the reality is we just don't have the time. So let's work now at level 1. And let's look at all 5 of these parts, an introduction and then 4 parts to follow. And again, as I said, I'll be referencing paragraphing here instead of line numbers as I've done in the Milton lectures. Obviously, I reference line numbers, but here I'm simply going to have to reference paragraph numbers. So let's go to work. The introduction, the opening of the American Scholar, and an oration delivered August 3-1, 1837. Let's read the first paragraph together, if for no other reason than I want to begin to expose you to what great writing is all about. Now, we've said this in other lectures. If you want to be a great writer, you got to be a great reader. What, in fact, Emerson will call, in American Scholar, creative reading. If we have creative writing, and he says it, if we have creative writing, we should have creative reading. I have said to you in earlier lectures what I will say now. You have to become a better reader. But by better, I don't just mean faster. I mean to be a creative reader, to be able to connect new information to old information while you're reading. Let's just appreciate the prose genius of a craftsman like Emerson in this opening paragraph. Mr. President and gentlemen, I greet you on the recommencement of our literary year. Our anniversary is one of hope and perhaps, you got to love the word perhaps, not enough of labor. We do not meet for games of strength or skill, for the recitation of histories, tragedies, and odes like the ancient Greeks. It's significant. We're going to come back to the ancient Greeks later. For parliaments of love and poesy like the troubadours, the poets of the Middle Ages. Nor for the advancement of science like our contemporaries in the British and European capitals. And Emerson is already setting up this argument that he's going to say that America is somehow very special. This special kind of view of America that Walt Whitman will make most famous in Leaves of Grass is in many ways born in this essay. Oliver Wendell Holmes, of course, calling this, as we'll say in a moment again, the declaration of intellectual independence, certainly an independence away from Europe. Thus far, our holiday has been simply a friendly sign of the survival of the love of letters amongst the people too busy to give to letters anymore. Already Emerson was aware that the scholar's life was starting to pass away because of technology and the like. As such, it is precious as the sign of an indestructible instinct. Perhaps, again perhaps, the time has already come when it ought to be, and will be something else, when the sluggard intellect of this continent will look from under its iron lids and fill the postponed expectation of the world with something better than the exertions of mechanical skill. Our day of dependence, our long apprenticeship to the learning of other lands draws to a close. Again, an intellectual declaration of independence. The millions that around us are rushing into life cannot always be fed on the sire remains of foreign harvests. Events, actions arise that must be sung, that will sing themselves. And we think immediately of the influence of an essay like this on Walt Whitman. A few years later, in 1855, will publish Leaves of Grass. And then for the rest of his life, until 1892, in the deathbed edition of Leaves of Grass, Whitman will sing this idea that America is the poem, the great poem. And this notion of how important America is to the rest of the world is born in many ways with Emerson, and some have argued even this essay. Who can doubt that poetry will revive and lead in a new age, as the star in the constellation Harp, which now flames in our zenith, astronomers announce, shall one day be the pole star for 1,000 years? In other words, the time is now. The time is upon us. Let's just put it in our notes right away. And you sense it right away, even in the prose as I'm reading it for us. Emerson is a great optimist. He is a great believer in hope and the future. And the optimism that is so much a part of American thought is born in many ways in an essay like this and in a speech like this as he's giving it. Again, as we've said, the great American poet Oliver Wendell Holmes declared that this essay was America's great declaration of intellectual independence. We already had, of course, political independence declared. In the second paragraph, we have the mention of new days and events, and of course the mention of the American scholar. And then in paragraph number 3 and 4, we'll begin with an analogy or a fable, as he will call it, where he says it, man has been divided into men in the same way that a hand is divided up into fingers. And then he will make the observation in paragraph 3-4. He says, that it has been spilled into drops and cannot be gathered. The state of society is one in which the members have suffered amputation from the trunk and strut about so many walking monsters, a good finger, a neck, a stomach, an elbow, but never a man. That is to say, man is thus metamorphosed into a thing, paragraph number 5, into many things. The planter, who is man sent out into the field to gather food, is seldom cheered by any idea of the true dignity of his ministry. It's an interesting idea, and we're going to come back to it at the end of the essay. Emerson will make the argument that work is precious. Okay, I say this oftentimes in 303 to us, don't I? That when we're studying, we're doing something really important. Work of all kinds. We never make fun of any kind of work, no matter how menial that work must be. Think about all of the important things that have to happen for you to be able to sit inside of this room and for us to grow and learn together. Someone had to build this room. Someone had to build this school. Somebody has to take care of taking care of cleaning, and all of that work is vital. It's all important, and Emerson's going to celebrate it as well. At paragraph 5, we've said it right. Nothing is beyond a man's work. We see nothing beyond our work. We're stuck in our work, he says it that way. At paragraph number 6, once we were a man thinking, now we are simply just a mere thinker, a parrot of other man's thinking. This will be a huge part of the Emersonian notion of self-reliance, independence, and individualism. And then finally, to finish our introduction here at paragraph 7, is not indeed every man a student, and do not all things exist for the student's behoof? In other words, what we will call lifelong learning. Go back to our comments on Ben Franklin and the importance of lifelong learning. You've got to believe that your life is always about learning new things, because if you stop learning new things, you become dead. And for Emerson, he's already aware and afraid that America is becoming intellectually stagnant. He'll make this observation as we move now into part 2. Part 2 is the paragraphs 8, 9, and the influence of nature. Here he will comment on nature as teacher. He will say that the mind is similar to nature in some ways, and in some ways, like Emerson's really famous essay, Nature, of 1836, just the year before, he's going to talk about the cyclical or the circular power of nature. We think of the Taoist symbol, of the yin-yang symbol. Go back to some of the comments that I made of the British romantic poet Blake and his ideas of songs of innocence, songs of experience. He talks about order and the importance of order as another similarity that we learn from nature. And we take chaos and we somehow form unity, and that the nature and the soul leads to the what he calls one root. Finally, he finishes this section by pointing out, know yourself and therefore know nature. They go together, they are symbiotic. He will, in paragraph number 8, he will make the argument that our learning theory is going to be here now introduced. To the young mind, everything is individual, stands by itself. By and by, it finds how to join two things and see in them one nature, then three, then 3,000. And so, tyrannized over by its own unifying instinct, it goes on trying things together. That notion of tying things together, right? Diminishing anomalies, discovering roots running underground, whereby contrary and remote things cohere and flower out from one stem. It's a beautiful word picture. The idea that when you look at Ruthie's tree, there's the stuff you can see, but there's the stuff that you know exists under the ground, if that is a live tree, right? And to that degree, our learning is this way. So here we go. What is learning? Connecting new information to old information. And about that, we say a couple of things, don't we, when we always talk about learning theory. One is that each of us has to do that for ourselves. You can't have other people learn for you. And 2, we connect new information to old information in very creative ways, right? I mean, Howard Gardner, the great educational psychologist, has pointed out, there's all kinds of ways that the mind does this, that the intellect does this, these multiple intelligences as we talked about them. Our challenge, of course, is to learn how we do this best, and then, of course, to begin to appropriate that learning for ourselves. the ninth paragraph. Let's go there really quickly. And he makes the observation: science is nothing but the finding of analogy, identity in the most remote parts. I mean, think about the ways in which that is so true. When you're sitting in a biology class and you're studying photosynthesis, simply ask the question, what would happen if the process didn't work? Right? It's a fascinating way to study, to try and see the relationship, or we might say the contiguity of all things. In that process, we become scholars, learners, if you will. All right, let's go to part 3. Paragraphs 10 through 20. This is a huge part of this speech, and Emerson is going to talk about the influence of the past. Now, Emerson is a great student and reader himself. So obviously he's going to tip his hat to the past. We all stand on the shoulders of giants. One of the reasons that we are in school is so that we can learn to respect and appreciate those who came before. It is difficult sometimes for us to do that. Athletes have difficulty doing this because, of course, they look at those old pictures and all they want to comment on is, dude, what was up with the shorts, right? But the reality is, if you are involved in an athletic program, you owe your respect to those who came before. Intellectually, also the same is true. Let's go through the ideas first in general here in this part 3, and then we'll talk in specifics in paragraphs where I have some ideas I want to share with you. First of all, he's going to talk about the influence of books. The past, and of course it's huge, right? But he's also going to talk about the dangers of great books. And because we're working with the Harvard Classics, and I've mentioned Mortimer Adler's series of 1954 and 52-4, the Great Book series as it was referred to, and why some people are so upset or offended by what is often referred to as the canon of dead white males, I think for us, it's more important for us to say, we can read a scholar like Milton. We can appreciate his patriarchal, misogynistic views. We don't have to embrace them. And when we pick up, for example, an Alice Walker essay, In Search of Our Mother's Gardens, or, for example, when we pick up Gilman's Yellow Wallpaper and we read it together, if you know your Milton, you appreciate why those essays and those offerings by feminist writers of the 20th century are so important for us as we look at the entire picture. But you got to know the past to be able to critique the past.